Well, thanks very much. I appreciate the invitation, and it's great to see so many people on a bleak Friday night. Now, what is it? Thursday, yeah. I've just come back from overseas. Now, Elizabeth Street's a very important street for the development of my political economy because I grew up in Melbourne and I was an aberrant young boy, and I used to shoot through from school regularly, catch the train in from our Housing Commission slum out in eastern suburbs, and go to the International Bookshop in Elizabeth Street. And I used to be able to, I was just young and that's where I read all the Marx, Engels, Lenin, everything. And because I came from such a disadvantaged background, the old lady there was really kind to me and used to give me fruit because she'd expect me to turn up, and I'd get nutrition as well for the body, as well as being allowed just to hang out in the aisles reading the books. And that was a great era for me because they were my teenage years, and that really gave me a sense of being well read in history and political economy and political philosophy and all of those things. And you remember that, if you remember that era, all those books were only $1 each or something from Progress publishers in Moscow. And one of the worst things that happened when the Soviet Union collapsed was they burnt all of their inventory. I was absolutely shocked. But so Elizabeth Street's a great street for me. I like it. Now I've just come back from speaking in Europe for 3 weeks, 20 presentations in 19 days. So that included the places that were mentioned by Jeff, and also included speaking in Athens, speaking in the French Senate, the Italian Senate, speaking to grassroots activists in Manchester, London, speaking to the top end of town, the business chamber and the business leaders in Finland and across in Europe, speaking in Amsterdam and all these other places. And that's an incredible cross-section of groups that want to listen to me talk about modern monetary theory. So I'll talk about that today. Last night, interestingly, and I took Jeff's reference to the Labor Party, last night I gave a talk to Labor Party activists in Maitland, New South Wales, and that highlights the problem. I'll come back to that. So I was given a fairly prescriptive set of questions. Okay. And I was asked to talk about how we got into this mess. And the mess is quite clear now after 3 decades of neoliberalism, what we now call neoliberalism. It started as monetarism in the economics profession, and then it seeped out like an infestation. And, the manifestations are very clear. If we had a report card up here, and if I give video slide presentations, you can see a report card, but it's easy to understand. Precarious work. You're now down on the street here, you've got to sort of duck and weave from all the scooters rushing around, nearly killing you. This is the young people. I was on a panel not long ago, and the youth of New South Wales Youth of the Year was there, and she announced to the audience, there are no workers anymore, we're just all entrepreneurs. This is the problem. And these are our kids driving scooters that they've got to provide themselves. When I went to work first, the capital was provided by the boss, and we got a wage for working on their capital. And now you have to provide your own capital. You don't have award wages anymore. You don't have sickness benefits. You don't have holiday pay, and you have 0-hour contracts. That's what we're doing to our children. And we've got underemployment and unemployment adding up now to 13.9%. And my profession has the audacity. It's the most shameless profession there is, economists. They have the audacity to say we're close to full employment. 1.9 million people don't get enough hours of work, including 0 hours. And we've got a degradation of public infrastructure. So I was in Italy, and the Italian government, of course, under pressure from the European Union, which is the exemplar of the neoliberal infestation, the EU, they privatised all their road system, the Autostrade. Benetton bought the licence, they run it, they hiked the fees, didn't do any maintenance, and so you get the Genoa bridge collapse. Now the Italian government is closing all these major bridges across all the major arteries in Italy because they're dangerous, because they haven't been maintained. The main access from west from Germany now, where all the trucks, the big export model of Germany now is closed to trucks because it's too dangerous to transit through, so they go 32 k's north to cross the Rhine. Lack of maintenance. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, the German government tells you all about how wonderful their fiscal surpluses are. And we've got a degradation of public services and a pernicious income support system. And on top of all of that, we've got a banking system out of control. I mean, the Royal Commission was a joke. It just touched the surface. And it was deliberately designed to touch that because the government didn't really want it anyway. So they can always set the terms of reference for Royal Commissions appropriately. And on top of all of that, we've got an ecological crisis on our hands, a climate crisis. So the combination of a social and a climate, an environmental crisis coming together, and they're linked intrinsically. So all this talk of, well, we can't have liberal agendas, social liberal agendas, that's in the classic liberal sense, of, you know, Medicare for all and better public infrastructure and job guarantees and all of this. We can't mix that with climate activism because the right wing won't buy it, and so we won't get anywhere. But if we don't have a social agenda in this transformation that's required, we won't get anywhere anyway. Now, how did we get there? Well, if you think about it and study your history, this all started in the late 60s. And what really was the situation was that the post-war consensus, the big nation-building era that allowed people like me who grew up in a minimum wage household with alcoholism after the damage to my father of the war, that allowed people like me to move from abject poverty to become a professor of economics and go to school. We had free school uniforms, books, rubbers, everything given to us every year. So we moved from that welfare state, full employment, and my old man was able to work even though he was pretty damaged by the Second World War because we had full employment. He could always get a job. Even though he didn't earn much, he could always work. If I'd have grown up in this era, in those circumstances, I'd be injecting heroin, probably. Whatever. And so that era of social democratic movements that the great progressive political traditions embraced in line meant that people had, you know, if unemployment went above 2%, the government lost office. For those old enough to remember the 61, I'm not old enough, but I know historically, the 61 election, Menzies nearly lost power because unemployment went to 2.1%. The interesting story, by the way, is that the only way he won by one seat, it was an inner Brisbane seat and he got Communist Party preferences. It's a very cool story, that. But we had full employment, we had reductions in income inequality, reductions in wealth inequality. If you happened to fall in between the cracks, there was always an income support available for you. You could always get a job. You could always get good public services as a right of citizenship. And they were provided by a public sector who was interested in social benefits, not private profits. And of course, that system screwed with the heads of capital because that meant that income that was being produced had to be distributed more fairly than they wanted. And so by the late 60s, if you remember the sort of programs, the Monday conference program on the ABC, Monday nights at 9:30, I think it was, I was just a kid, but the big topics were trade union power, and profit squeeze and all of these topics. And what capital, and this was a global phenomenon, and what capital decided to do was get strategic and undermine the social democratic era. And a classic statement of that is the Powell Manifesto, which was written by Lewis Powell under commission from the top end of town in the US, and he published that in 1971. A couple of weeks later, he was appointed to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon, most conservative US Supreme Court judge in history. He outlined a brilliant strategy to recapture the power for capital. And this was to create think tanks. This is when all the think tanks started to be created. Massive propaganda units masquerading as research institutes. This is when the infiltration of the mainstream media started, and that's when Fox Media and all of this started. This is when the infiltration into the university system and into manipulating the curriculum started. And I could go on and on about that, but it was a brilliantly conceived plan to indoctrinate all of us into the dangers of fiscal deficits, governments using their fiscal policy to create full employment, into the dangers of full employment. You know, if you look back through the Cabinet archives in the late 60s, there's letters sent from the top end of town here, top business leaders to the Treasurer of the day, demanding that the government increase the unemployment rate to put the trade unions back in their box. You can find it online, it's in the National Archives. This is what was going on at that era. Now, meanwhile, back at the ranch, the progressive side of the story started to lose the plot completely. This was an era of global financial capital emerging, global supply chains emerging, increased global access and trade. And what the right told the left was that this meant that the state was now impotent, that the state had to be compliant to the needs of financial capital. And if they dared upset financial capital, the currency would get crashed. And the stupid left bought that. You know, I went to conferences as a young student, a young university student in the sort of early 70s, political economy conferences, and this is what we were told. You know, the state can't intervene anymore, we're finished. And you had Labor parties becoming monetarists. The first one was the British second Wilson government in the early 70s, where Dennis Healey, the Chancellor, declared that the British government had run out of money and had to go to the IMF to get money. And James Callaghan became the Prime Minister in that era, and he told the 1976 annual conference at Blackpool of the Labor Party that the days in which the government can use its fiscal policy to improve jobs and advance employment and growth are over. The role of government now is to fight inflation and to stabilise and to do what financial markets needed for financial stability. And the left academics, and this became really, as I was now moving into postgraduate studies and heading to academia, the whole debate of the progressive academics was not about class anymore. It was not about your location as a worker or against capital. It started to get completely besotted by the postmodernist movements that emerged. The deconstruction era, where everything had to be deconstructed down to its atomic elements. And what that meant in reality was that we started to define ourselves in terms of identity, not in terms of class. And so we had all these academic studies coming up like mushrooms on gender and on sexuality and on ethnicity. Now, don't get me wrong, all these things are incredibly important for progressives to get right and to understand the way those things are manipulated by the hegemon to divide and conquer us. So don't think I'm saying they're unimportant, but they are not isolated from class, industrial class. And so what happened was that the main heterodox research programs, the main progressive economists and social scientists just abandoned the main game, which is macroeconomics. If you're fighting out distribution of income and full employment and all of that, good jobs and that's macro. That's about, you've got to have a handle on macroeconomics. And the progressives just abandoned all of that and started to sort of go down rabbit holes and get into arcane debates about minutiae, about hermeneutics and ontology and all this stuff. And I'd sat through conferences, political economy conferences all around the world as a postgraduate student, like days of talk about minutiae, about ontology. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the neoliberals were reconfiguring this. They knew the state hadn't gone away. They knew that if they wanted to get their agenda up and running, they had to reconfigure the state in their own agenda. Every single one of these things that have contributed to that report card have emerged through legislative or regulative processes. They've manipulated the state. They've co-opted the state. They've captured the state to do the working of capital. The state in the full employment era was a mediator between the class conflict. Now it's an agent of capital. And the left and the political left have just completely abandoned all of that understanding. And now you have, at the macroeconomic level, there's virtually no difference between the voice of the historical voice of the trade union movement, the Labor Party, and the Tories. Virtually no difference. And in the lead up to the last election, here in May, I'll go back. After the election, the new shadow treasurer, I've been in England, so I was about to say shadow chancellor, the treasurer, Jim Chalmers, was on Radio National saying we can't consider putting the unemployment rate up, which is increasingly below the poverty rate, if it damages our surplus ambitions. Yeah, you just about fall over. I nearly crashed the car. I was driving home from work. It was on PM. I nearly crashed the car. I was so angry. But that's our progressive voice. And the Greens were mentioned. Well, I call them neoliberals on bikes. They've completely lost the plot too. And so that's why we are where we are. And if you look at trends in Europe, I just did some research recently, and 1995, the far right parties captured about 10% of the total vote in all the member states in national elections, aggregated. Now they capture about 37%, and that's accelerating. And a few years ago I was in Madrid and I was giving a talk to some leftists, allegedly. And the day before in Andalusia, there had been 100,000 people marching with placards, "We want jobs." And I said to the audience, "Who do you think organised that march?" And they said, "Oh, the Socialist Party, obviously." Being leftists, I think that would be the case. It was the far right organising it. And the point is that the main traditional political voices of progressive politics, of workers' interests, voicing our anxieties as workers against capital who's wanting to screw us all the time. That anxiety is now being voiced by far-right politicians in the same way that Hitler voiced the anxieties in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, the Labor Party just want to have a bloody fiscal surplus. Without even knowing what it is, they just think it sounds cool. And that's a mindless objective to have. If you've got 13.9% labour underutilisation, then you need substantially larger fiscal deficits. Now, what are we going to do about all this? last night I was confronted at this Labor Party by some of the Labor Party meeting by some young apparatchiks who told me that if we have deficits, we'll be like Zimbabwe. This is the future leadership of the Labor Party. And I remember back in the 80s when I sort of knew all of the sort of movers and shakers in the Labor Party were all young. And I looked around a room one day, and I might mention names, and I said, to myself, if you're the bloody leadership of the Labor Party, we're screwed. And I said it again last night. The next generation of leaders are going to be worse than the previous generation. And you just look around all the national elections. The most recent wipeout of the social democratic voice in traditional politics was in Slovenia the weekend before last. The SPD in Germany virtually wiped out. Socialist Party in France virtually wiped out. Labor Party in Britain lost an election against a pernicious Tory government that's enacted unbelievable hardship for nearly 10 years. And I remember just after the June referendum on Brexit, I had a private meeting with John McDonnell, who was the Shadow Chancellor for the Labor Party in London. And I said to John, I know him, and I said, if the Labor Party doesn't embrace Brexit and make it a left project, then you're cooked. He said, oh, no, the majority of Labor Party voters don't want it. I said, yeah, but the majority of your seats are Leave seats. And it's because of the skew of all of the so-called woke Londoners who have benefited from globalisation and freedom of movement and all the rest of it. They're concentrated in London, but the North and the Midlands, I was in Manchester the weekend before last, it's shocking. And I was doing my PhD in Manchester. I couldn't believe how bad it's become. And it's no surprise that coming up against the worst Tory government in years, with massive leadership uncertainty, the Labor Party managed to lose, and the majority of seats that transferred from Labor to Tory were in Leave constituencies. And meanwhile, if you've been following the British Labor leadership debate, they're becoming obsessed with transphobic debates. And this is because a women's refuge in London has made the case that they're by law bound to adopt policies that are based upon sex divisions, biological male or female. That's the law. And there's a famous case in Britain of a male who identified as female, who demanded to be moved from a male prison into a female prison, and then raped women in the female prison. And this has caused incredible debate about self-identification and all of those identity issues. And that's completely subsumed the Labor Party at a time when the Tories are just creating havoc. Okay, so what do we do about it? The first thing we've got to do about it, if I ask people in this audience, and Josh, you're not allowed to answer, because I know he knows, how many people think when you're paying your annual taxes that you're funding government spending? Now, you don't have to be embarrassed. We won't have a hand show. Just, I believe that the majority of the room would say yes. And how many people do you think that when the government issues debt, that's funding spending beyond their tax revenue? And the majority of people will say yes. And you're always wrong if you say yes. And I'm one of the founders of this modern monetary theory, which is now a major, what we set out in the mid-90s to do, because the left had completely abandoned macroeconomics, left the contest to the neolibs. And all the Labor Party could do was mimic the neoliberal mantra of surpluses are good, deficits are bad. What we decided to do with this project, and I started it with a Wall Street millionaire, could have a B instead of an M, And we wanted to create, it was a unique partnership, by the way, but that's another story. But we wanted to create a body of macroeconomic work, a theory and practice, that would be a contest for the neoliberals, which we said were wrong. And that's what modern monetary, how it developed. Now it's taken off because what people have discovered after 30 or 40 years of this absolute nonsense is that nothing works anymore. That scorecard is killing people. And, you know, even grassroots movements like this have probably always known it. But what also is happening, I'm increasingly giving talks to the big financial market interests, the big investment banks, the big pension funds. And they are incredibly interested in the ideas. And why? Because they've now finally worked out that their business model is being undermined by listening to mainstream economists. How? Take an example. During the global financial crisis, when the deficit started to rise as a consequence of meeting the demands of the crisis, all the mainstream economists, and this is what they teach students, unfortunately, brainwash students, it's not really teaching, it's indoctrination, they predicted that bond yields would rise because of higher risk. The bond markets would freak out with these deficits rising. And if bond yields rise, prices fall. So if you take long positions, buy bonds, then you risk taking capital losses because the prices will fall. And they also predicted, because the central banks were running QE, that is buying a lot of government bonds and exchanging it for bank reserves, in other words, monetising, pumping in liquidity to the system, they predicted that would be inflationary, because that's what they teach their students. And so all these financial markets, believing my profession, because we've created this authority around ourselves as if we know stuff, got out of bonds and into real estate, because if you get into real assets when inflation's going on, you've got a best chance of protecting the real value of your investment. Well, they lost heaps because none of the exact opposite happened. And more recently, I was talking to a couple of the really big pension funds in Europe. And what's happening is that there's now an increasing maturity mismatch going on. What does that mean in English? Well, what it means is that they've got liabilities, that they've got contractual liabilities, that they've got to stump up cash on a regular basis, pension funds, and insurance funds are included in this. And their asset side has to generate returns that are commensurate with their commitments and well-timed to make sure they've got appropriate cash flow. Now, what's happening is the obsession with fiscal surpluses and the drying up of public infrastructure spending is causing them not to have, the financial markets not to have solid investment opportunities. That's their business model, historically, parasitic. Financial markets are just parasites. And also the dominance of monetary policy has now driven monetary policy to its extremes, negative interest rates. They can't make a buck when they're putting money into banks and having to pay the banks to put the money in there. That's what a negative interest rate is. And so what's happening is the assets that these big funds have historically used to generate returns are no longer generating returns commensurate with their liabilities. And so what are they doing? They're doing all that they can, and that's to move their asset portfolios into increasingly risky positions, such that it's gone for so long now that they're now on the brink of insolvency. Small environmental changes in the financial markets, in the conditions, what have you, maybe coronavirus, will drive them insolvent, and these are the major superannuation funds, and if that happens, there'll be chaos. So they're now protesting and demanding a paradigm shift in economics, and they look around and they couldn't find anybody other than our work on MMT that gives the alternative, as was outlined for 25 years, a coherent alternative to the way in which the system operates. And I haven't got time tonight to talk in detail about it, but here's an inkling. Take two situations. One where there's idle resources. productive resources. So there's unemployment like we have out there today. The currency issuing government, that's the government of Australia, is the only institution in our monetary system that issues the currency. It has no financial constraints in bringing all of those idle productive resources back into use, including all idle labour. So when we've got mass unemployment, it's not a financial constraint, it's a political choice. The Australian government has no financial constraints at all, and what that means is that our taxes don't fund their spending. They don't need our taxes because they issue the currency. We need their currency before we can pay taxes. And if you've done Logic 101 in philosophy, which I did, you know that causality means something, the causation has to come before the other thing. We can't pay our taxes until they've spent their currency into existence. So in that first situation, there's no constraints on government increasing its spending. And if there are idle productive resources, well then we know that the fiscal deficit, that's the difference between government spending and taxation, is too small. And at the moment, the fiscal deficit should be about 5% of GDP. So pursuing a surplus is exactly the opposite thing that the government should be doing. And yesterday's national accounts, why are we growing 1.5% per annum below trend? It's because they've been pursuing a fiscal surplus. Idiots. Now take a second situation to understand a bit about constraints on government spending and the role of taxes. The second situation is where you've got all the productive resources are currently being used. Now that's a very rare situation in this current era. Now what happens if the government wants to increase, in that context, wants to increase the size of the public sector, which means it wants to command more of the productive resources for itself, for its programs? Well, if it tries to increase, it knows in the first case it can bring those resources into productive use by increasing its spending. But in the second case, if it tries to just increase its spending, it will be competing against existing users of those resources, and that's where you get inflationary pressures emerging. And so you've got a constraint being hit at that stage, not a financial constraint. It can always increase spending whenever it likes, and it spends just by typing numbers into accounts on an hourly basis. Just tick, 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 and millions go into various bank accounts. But the constraint it faces is a real resource constraint. And what it has to do in that case, if it's got a political agenda to increase the size of government spending, what it has to do, size of government programs and infrastructure, whatever, well then what it's got to do in that case is deprive the existing users of those resources. That's us. And how might it do us? How might it do that? It has to reduce our ability to spend to buy those resources. How might it do that? Levies a tax. So the taxes reduce our disposable income, reduce our ability to buy things, and therefore command productive resources. The taxes are not to fund the spending, it's to create the real resource space in which the government can spend into without creating inflation. It's a mouthful, I know, but it's easy to understand if you say it slowly. I said it slowly. The taxes are there to create the real resource space, to create idle real resources that are currently being used, so that the government can spend and buy the use of those resources, transfer them into the public sector without creating inflationary pressures. There is only a real resource constraint. There's never a financial constraint on government spending. Okay, so I've got a few more minutes, and so the first part of a progressive fight back is for us to get smart. The Powell Manifesto in 1971 was a brilliant strategic document, well thought out, really well articulated and coordinated, and that changed the whole paradigm then. And we all bought it. The left bought it. So the first thing that we've got to do, in my view, is to educate ourselves in economics. It might sound dull, it's a dismal science after all, But unless you can, at dinner parties, in your branches of political meetings, at activist meetings here, talking to people on the tram, wherever, unless you know the arguments and can refute the arguments that deficits cause inflation, that deficits cause interest rates to rise, that deficits mean the government will run out of money, unless you can articulate all of the reasons why all of those statements are false and articulate the alternative, that fiscal surpluses are only possible if it kills our wealth. That's what a fiscal surplus is. When Peter Costello said that he's getting the debt monkey off the Australian people's back when he was running surpluses, what he really should have been saying was he was destroying our wealth. Now, I can't explain that, but that's one of the ways in which you should learn you should learn how to articulate. So the first stage is education. And the other thing is you've got to disabuse yourselves of all of these progressive things that are out there now, and it's in the American election, it's in the Australian election, Labor Party mantra, that we need to somehow tax the rich to fund public services. That is a complete neoliberal sellout, because you're immediately conceding the framing and the notion that the government is financially constrained. Now, we might want to tax the rich. Why? Because we want to reduce their purchasing power and reduce their ability to lobby and unduly influence the political agenda. But we never want to tax them to get their money. We just want to deprive them of their money because the government doesn't need their money. So when progressives get up and think they're glowing with heart on the sleeve joy that we're going to punish those bastards by taxing them to get their money, they're just buying into things that the rich are important in some way. And the other one is this idea that we need market solutions to the climate crisis. So carbon taxes and emission trading schemes. As soon as you talk about market systems, you're a neoliberal. The climate crisis will never be solved with a carbon tax or an emission trading system. They're always corruptible. They have no equity ability. These offset schemes that are proposed where first world Australian polluters keep polluting and then go and invest a pittance in less developed countries and destroy local sustainable agricultural systems, local community subsistence, and then claim an offset by building a dam somewhere or something, they're disasters. And the progressives that think that we're going to solve the climate crisis in that way, forget it. The way we're going to solve the climate crisis in part is a regulative, rules-based approach. What does that mean? That means that the Prime Minister announces tomorrow that the coal industry in the Hunter district, where I mostly hang out when I've got my feet on the ground, is going to close in 10 years. That's it. We're not going to have a carbon abatement system or anything like that. We're just going to close carbon-intensive industries. That's it. We're going to make sure agriculture becomes permaculture-based. That's it. It becomes the law. That's the way to solve it. And in May, I'll make a rather large announcement, I hope. It's called Just 2030. Just is just, urgent, sustainable transformation. And it's an organisation we're creating. I'm not at liberty to say who's involved yet, but it's global. We've got a movement we've developed in West Africa, in Timor, in Europe, in Britain and in Australia. We're developing the infrastructure. And this is a really big plan, initially to create an infrastructure and a movement, and then ultimately to become a Senate party. Because you can't infiltrate the lower house, but you can infiltrate the Senate in Australia. And what Just 2030 is about is making the economy work for us, not for the top end of town. It's to restore public infrastructure, quality, It's to restore public ownership of essential services, including energy, water, public transport, and all of those things. So in terms, I was asked to talk about socialism. Well, this is sort of a precondition for a socialist state. It's to introduce a job guarantee, an unconditional job offer to anybody who wants it at a socially inclusive minimum wage in the public sector. Now, when I was young, as a musician in Melbourne, I was always able to go down Spencer Street Goodyards, where you got a job on any single day on the rail loading the rail trucks. On any morning at 7 o'clock, I could go down there and get a number and I could get a job. And that allowed us to have an income when my band wasn't making much money. And it's, in our view, it's the government's responsibility for full employment. And the Just 2030 will advocate nationalisation of banks. More modern version, I'm afraid. But the banks are, the banks have been allowed to become casinos, speculative casinos. And they are effectively public-private partnerships because they privatise the gains and socialise their losses. So what's the point of them in that context? They're always going to be bailed out because they're too important. They're essential service, so they should be like energy, like public transport, like water. And we're also going to be developing concepts of zero emissions. And we're doing work, for example, the port of Newcastle is the largest coal export port in the world, in case you didn't know. It's massive. Well, the port of Newcastle is, the CEO, I had to talk to him the other day, they're understanding that we've got to just stop coal. So they're going to create a hydrogen facility at the port and a solar farm. It's got a lot of land. They're going to create a solar farm there. And so we can reconfigure, and Just 2030 is not going to do what the Greens do, and that is get on a bus from Sydney and motor up the highway to an area that relies on carbon-intensive jobs and tell them they've got to close their carbon-intensive jobs, and then as soon as they can, they piss off back to Sydney. The thing about the just part is that we've got to have a just structural transformation. And over the last 20 years, I've done a lot of work on this concept that you can't go into a community that depends upon activities that we consider to be environmentally unsustainable, which we want to eliminate, without offering those communities jobs and pathways, which might include migration out of those communities with lots of support, which might include subsidising new activities, which might include very generous income support payments. And for a long time I've advocated that the Hunter area, which is going to be devastated when we just close coal down, become a renewable energy hub. Used to be a steel industry town. It's got lots of skilled labour. So a renewable energy hub could create a whole vertically integrated occupational structure in really advanced research and development and innovation, right down to maintenance, and the down doesn't mean lower value jobs. I'm just, to put that in context, the cleaners, in my view, of the world are the most valuable jobs. And they'll be very valuable when this virus comes along. But so a vertically integrated occupational structure that allows the workers who are going to be put out of work from coal to transit into well-paid, secure jobs that are not just meaningless. So in that sense, to finish, I think Just 2030, I don't know what socialism is anymore. I'm from my days down in Elizabeth Street International Bookshop, socialism is the ownership, public ownership of the material means of production. That's it. I doubt whether we can get to that state, and I'm not sure we want to, although for those who are old enough to remember all of the calculation debates, these were in the beginnings of the Soviet period, and debates with Oscar Langer and these characters and the Austrians, and the debate was essentially that a planned economy couldn't work because of the problems of information. So the plan, the GOZ plan or whatever it would be, which created output in factories, couldn't be responsive enough for consumer needs. So you get butter mountains emerging and consumers wanting all these other things and not able to buy them. That was the fundamental problem of the Soviet system. But that debate wouldn't have happened now because we've got computer networks. We've got real instantaneous, real-time information flows that can immediately tell a factory what the consumers have just bought and where the productive resources and inputs have to be reallocated to match consumer demand. So, but I think small shops are okay. So I think Just 2030, I hope when we announce it and you see who's involved, some pretty big players and some surprising players that you'll get behind it, and abandon all of this. And meanwhile, back at the ranch while you're waiting, you're educating yourself on MMT. And you can read my blog. There's lots of material out there now to educate yourself. There's Josh Dalton here runs an MMT discussion group in Melbourne. There's discussion groups in Sydney. We've got them all around the world now. And you educate yourselves, become empowered. The education's an enlightening force, and you're living in a fictional world that my profession has created for you to manipulate you into submission so that the top end of town do what they want, and you're just compliant consumers. So education's your first challenge, and then I hope when we announce Just 2030 officially and you see what we're up to, then you can get behind that as progressives, and we are on the road at grassroots level to taking back the system. Thank you.